Hello everyone, my name is Finding Pepper and welcome to episode 4 of the 3D Minecraft tutorial series. This episode we will be coding breaking and placing blocks as well as a simple inventory, that is a hotbar. So we are turning our Minecraft game into something a bit more Minecrafty. Even if you don't want to code Minecraft, you'll be able to use this feature in whatever 3D game you decide to make, as it will be very helpful for building levels for, say, a platformer or something like that. Anyways, with all that said, let's start by grabbing our textures. Now, just like we did in episode 2, head down into the description and click the link to my YouTube tutorial assets project. It will bring you here where we can find the 3D episode 4 sprite. Now, to use this sprite, you'll need to right click on it and click export. This will give you a .sprite3 file, which you can then go back to your original project. Here in TurboWarp, click upload sprite and choose the .sprite3 file that got exported. So here we are, and you can see we have a whole bunch of various textures here. I'll hide this sprite. We'll start by just dragging the crosshair sprite into the game sprite. Alright, let's display this crosshair by going into the display view custom block. Here at the end, go to 0, 0, switch costume to crosshair and stamp. We should also hide at the start of this block, just so we're only displaying this via the stamp block, because we can stamp even if the sprite is hidden. Let's run this. We now have our crosshair in the center of the screen. Alright, now let's code the scripts for figuring out what block we're looking at. I'm going to make a variable called targeted block for all sprites. Let's go to create camera view, and this is where we cast our rays. In fact, while we're here, I'm going to rename our look forward block cast ray, because that look forward name was kind of confusing because it was very similar to our move forward block. Now, after we add our pixels to the view list, we'll check with an if else if view x and view y are both equal to 0. So this is the center ray. It's the one cast at where our crosshair is, and it's the one that will determine what our targeted block is. So in here, we'll check if collided is greater than 0. Then we can get gradient x of position x, y, z, and set targeted block to block index. Sorry, I lied about this being an if else. The outer one is an if, and the inner one is an if else. In the else of if collided is greater than 0, we'll set targeted block to -1, meaning that we are not targeting a block. So if we didn't collide with something, we won't have a targeted block. We can also add an and to this collided is greater than 0 statement. We can check if the dist variable is less than 5 to limit our reach, so we can only break and place blocks within 5 blocks of ourselves. Now that we've got our targeted block, we can check to break it. So I'll make a block called break place blocks. Break/place blocks. Run without screen refresh. And I'll stick it in our forever loop after move camera and before we create camera view. Now in Minecraft, whether you break or place a block is determined by whether you left click or right click. But in Scratch, there's no distinction between left and right clicks. So we'll need to use whether the mouse is being held to determine whether we should break or place a block. So if we hold down the mouse, we begin to break the block, and if we just click the mouse once, then we will be able to place our block. So I'm going to make a variable called mouse for the sprite only. This will hold how long we've been holding down the mouse. I'll check if mouse down, and if it is, we can change mouse by 1, and in the else, we'll set mouse to 0. So we change mouse by 1 every frame that we hold the mouse, so we can tell exactly how long we've been holding our mouse down. Now, if we've been holding our mouse down long enough, so say if mouse equals 22, then I'll make a block called break block. run without screen refresh. Then we can use that right here. Then after we do this, we can reset our mouse variable back to 4. I'm not setting it to 0 right here. I'll explain why when we get to placing. Okay, now for our break block custom block. First, we need to make sure that we are actually targeting a block. So we'll check if targeted block is greater than -1. We can replace item targeted block of grid with 0, which is air, thus breaking the block. Finally, we'll set targeted block to -1 again, just to avoid any funny business that may creep up. Alright, let's run this and try holding down on our block here, and then it disappears when you hold down long enough. Just like that. Of course, when we run the project again, all the blocks are back here. Alright, now let's do placing. For this, we need to find not only the block that we're targeting, but also the block next to the block that we're targeting. We'll go back into create camera view, and we're going to make a variable called targeted air, which will hold the block next to the block that we're targeting. To find this block, we can move backwards a little bit in our array, so we can get to the block that the ray passed through before it got to the new block. So we'll move forward by -0.01. Then again, we'll get grid index of position x, y, z, and finally set targeted air to block index. In the else, we can set targeted air to -1, just like we did with targeted block. Now back in break place blocks, we want to place if we release our mouse very shortly after pressing it. So in the else of if mouse down, before we set mouse to 0, we'll check if mouse is greater than 0 and mouse is less than 4, meaning we've been holding it for less than 4 frames. If this is true, we will place block. Run without screen refresh, and then we'll stick that block right there. Now we'll want to do something very similar that we did with break block, this time checking if targeted air is greater than -1. Then we replace item targeted air of grid with, and then for now I'll just choose a block to be placed. I'll go with 18, which is cobblestone for me. Then again we can set our targeted air back to -1 here, and also in break block, like so. Now let's run this and look at the side of a block, and if we click, we will place down a cobblestone block right there. Wonderful. And then if we hold, like so, we will be able to break the block. Alright, now let's get a little indicator of what block we're targeting, as well as how broken a block is. So when we hold down a block, it displays that characteristic break animation. Head into our asset sprite and drag out the overlays costume into the scanner sprite. Now rather than scanning just our textures costume, I'll repeat 2 here. So we scan twice. Then I'll make a variable called sheetNum for the sprite only to hold what sheet we are currently scanning. Before our repeat loop, I'll set sheetNum to 3, or whatever costume your textures costume is, and also make sure our overlays costume is the very next one after that, because at the end of our repeat loop each time, we will change sheetNum by 1. And then when we switch costume, we'll switch costume to our sheetNum variable. So that will be 3 or 4, so switching costume based on the costume number. Now I'm going to scan our costumes into 2 different lists, so we can easily get out these overlay costumes. So I'll make a new list called overlay scan for all sprites. Now I don't want to have to duplicate any of our scan code here, so rather than scanning directly into the scan list, I'll make a list called temp scan for this sprite only, and replace all instances of the scan list with the temp scan list. Make sure you have every single one of these, because if you don't, that can cause issues. So go left to right, top to bottom, making sure you get them all. If you have the find add-on enabled, which I recommend, you can find the scan list, and click on it, and it should say 0 right there. Now we need to get our values from the temp scan list into the scan list. So we can do that after we broadcast scan complete. Repeat length of temp scan, adding item 1 of temp scan to our scan list, and deleting the first item of temp scan. So then we get our next item in place 1, then we add that to the scan list, get rid of that, and we have a new item back in place 1, so on and so forth until we've repeated through the entire list. Now we should also delete all of scan and delete all of overlay scan in when I receive begin scan up at the top. Now let's try scanning all of our textures and run the project, and your textures should be displaying exactly the same as they were. Instead of just doing the same thing for all of our textures, we can check if sheet num equals 4, which is our overlay texture costume. If this is the case, we'll duplicate the same code, but first we'll replace the scan list with the overlay scan, and also we need to check for transparency, because not all of these pixels have color in them. Some of them are transparent. Now there's no white pixels anywhere here, so we can simply check if the pixel matches the backdrop color, which is white. So we can check up here with an if else, and we'll put this add item to overlay scan in the else and keep the delete outside of it. We're checking if item 1 of temp scan, the item we're adding to our overlay list, is white, and that color is 163166656. So make sure you got that number exactly right, and if it is, we can simply just add a empty value to overlay scan. Now this is assuming you have a white backdrop, and you might want to have a slightly blue backdrop for, say, a sky. In fact, I'll do that right now. Just duplicate our empty backdrop, convert to bitmap, and fill with a nice sky blue color, like so. I'll name this one sky, and this one scan. Before we scan, we switch backdrop to scan, like so, and then at the end, we switch backdrop to sky. So we can now broadcast our message. Our textures should again be displaying perfectly fine, and now we're displaying the sky backdrop. And also in our repeat loop, we'll need to set our num textures variable differently with different sheets. So we can check if sheet num equals 4, set num textures to 10, and otherwise set it to 18 like we had before. One last thing, we need to make sure to move the show into the repeat loop, so we show each time we do it as well. So now when we run this, we should see our overlay scan is populated with some different values, including empty values. Now we can use this overlay scan in our find texture color at block. Now run these bottom two blocks. I'm going to get an if else, and I'll check if block index equals targeted block. So we're running the stuff inside here on the targeted block. Okay, inside here we can check if item texture IDX of overlay scan is greater than the empty value, and then we'll put this same thing down here in the else. So slight duplication of code, but it's not a big deal. So we're checking if this pixel is non-transparent. If it is transparent, we're just going to set the texture color to that of the block, but if that position in the overlay is non-transparent, we're going to overwrite the block's color with this color. So set color to item texture IDX of overlay scan. And keep in mind that we're only changing the texture index by the block in the else position. So this will be the first texture of the overlay scan list, which is just the empty cursor. So if we run this, now you'll see a black line appears around the blocks that we're highlighting. Now let's code the breaking animation. This is really simple now that we've done all of that. we can simply check if mouse is greater than 3. If it is, we'll change our texture index by the floor. Rather than using block -1, I'll use mouse -3 over 2. So the higher our mouse variable is, the higher the texture number will be. But in the else of this, if we are on a transparent pixel, we'll need to change our texture index back so we can get the correct index of the color underneath. So we'll change texture index by 0 minus this number here. So let's run this. Our textures should be displaying correctly. If we hold down, it will display the breaking animation. Lovely. Alright, but we still have a few bugs. Let's say if I start breaking this block and then move my cursor to a different block, it will be able to break that block instead. And it will not reset the mouse timer. So let's fix that. So in Create Camera View, when we do our set targeted block stuff, right after we get grid and exit position at XYZ, we'll check if not block index equals targeted block and mouse is greater than 3. So if we're holding down our mouse and our new targeted block index isn't the block index it was last frame, that is, we've moved our mouse from one block to a different block, then we will reset our mouse timer. So set mouse back to 4. Okay, we'll run this. Now begin breaking one block and then move it to a different block, and you can see we can keep holding down and moving between these blocks, and it will reset our mouse timer, like so. We can still place blocks just fine. Great. Now speaking of placing blocks, let's try to place a block where the player is. And you'll see we get pushed up to the top of this, but we can do it. If we move from moving while we place it, then we get snapped to the side into the void. So it's better if we just don't allow the player to place blocks where they are. To do this, head to the Place Block Custom Block, and here we can use our Handle Player Collisions in Direction block to test whether we're inside of a block after we place the block. So handle all player collisions in direction, then we can just choose a random direction. I'll say X and 1. Doesn't matter what direction you put here as long as it is a valid direction the player can move in. Now this will move the player, so we need to make sure we keep track of the player's position before we do this. I'll just use our X variable and set X to player X. Then after we do this, set player X back to our X variable. Now we can then check before we set our player X variable back to what it was before, if not X equals player X. So if we're in a different position than we were before, that means that we have collided with something, and that something is probably the block that we just placed. So we'll replace item target air of grid with 0. So we go back to air. Now if we run this, try to place a block below our feet, it does not work. We should still be able to place blocks elsewhere though. Alright, so we've got breaking and placing down pretty well. So what's next is the inventory. Alright, so we're going to need a list, which I'll call inventory, to hold what is in our inventory. I'll have 2 pieces of data for each thing in our inventory, similar to what we did with the view list. The first piece of data will be what block it is, the number of the block, and the second will be how many. So when our flag is clicked, I'll delete all of inventory and replace it with, I'll repeat 18 and add empty values to our inventory. And this is 18 because we have 9 slots and 2 pieces of data for each slot. Now we need a way to add things to our inventory. So I'll make a custom block called add to inventory and then an input item. Run without screen refresh. So when we're adding something to the inventory, either it could already be in the inventory in which case we'll need to add it to an existing stack, or it could not be in the inventory, in which case we'll need to replace the first available empty slot with the item. Now we could just use the inventory contains an item number of thing in inventory. However, because we have two pieces of data for each item, this won't work. For example, if we want to check if we have any of our block 1, so inventory contains 1, that might return true, but only because we have one of a different block. So we need a different way. We can use a simple for loop, which we've done before. We'll set our I variable to 1, repeat length of inventory divided by 2, each time changing I by 2. So we visit each set of two pieces of data exactly once. Then each time we'll check if item I of inventory equals item. And this is only going to be checking the items in the list which actually hold item IDs. So if it is item, we can replace item I plus 1 of inventory with item I plus 1 of inventory. Remember, this is the count, the second piece of data for this item, plus 1. So we increase the count by 1. Then we can stop the script. Now if we didn't stop the script here, that means that we did not find a matching item in our inventory. So we need to loop again and look for an empty space. So this time, rather than checking if item I of inventory is item, we'll check if it equals the empty value. If it does, we'll replace item I of inventory with item. So add our item here and replace the count with just simply 1. So when we're adding a new item to our inventory, we start with just one of them. Then again, stop the script. Alright, so in our break block code, we're going to be adding our blocks to the inventory. So before we replace item of grid, we'll add to inventory item targeted block of grid. We can make stone drop cobblestone by using our block variable. We'll set block to item targeted block of grid. Then we check if block equals 4, that is our stone. If it is, we'll set block to 18, which is cobblestone, and then add to inventory block. So let's show our inventory list and try breaking some blocks. So see at the start, it fills up with empty values. When we break our dirt, you'll see a 3 and a 1 gets added to our inventory, meaning we have 1 of block 3. Let's try placing down some cobblestone, and then I'll break this all. You can see that rather than adding a new entry after the first block we break, it just increases the count there. Now we need a way to display our inventory. So I'll make a new sprite and call it UI. Stands for user interface. Then we'll go into our asset sprite and grab all of our inventory related costumes, basically all of the ones we haven't used, starting with hotbar. Just drag these into the UI sprite. We've got them all here. We can delete costume 1, and we have hotbar, selection, some numbers, and some blocks. Now we want the displaying of our UI to be synced with our main loop. So in our main loop, we'll broadcast a message called display UI. Now in UI, when I receive this message, then we'll make a new block called display hotbar. Run without screen refresh, and put that right there. Now we'll start by setting size to 200, just so it's sized correctly. Then we'll switch costume to hotbar, and then we'll go to position x0, y -158. Then we stamp. Now we'll be looping through our inventory, drawing each of the items. And we need a variable to hold what position we're currently in our loop. And I'll call that variable slot for this sprite only. Set up a simple for loop by setting slot to 1, repeating length of inventory divided by 2, and each time changing slot by 2, loop through each item in the inventory exactly once. Each time we'll want to position ourselves correctly. So our first block will be at -160, but then we want to add to that some value based on what slot we're at. So we can use our slot variable. First of all, we'll subtract 1, so that means our first slot will be 0, then our next one will be 2, then 4, etc., rather than being 1, 3, 5. Now that we've got that number, we can divide by 2, then finally we'll multiply by the width of each of our slots, so 40. And then we get this formula. Now we'll switch costume to join block, the text block, and then item slot of inventory. And you can see each of our inventory items is named block 1, block 3, block 4, etc. So we can just use that name to get the costume we should switch to. Finally, we can stamp. Let's run this. Try breaking a block, and it should appear in our inventory. Lovely. Alright, but as it stands, we can't see how many of each item we have. So let's do that now. We'll use these number costumes, and then we'll stamp them below our object. These guys should be sized at 100% rather than 200%, meaning we'll need to set size to 200% before we stamp here, and then set size to 100% before we stamp our numbers. So to get to our first number, we'll change our x and y both by -10. Then we'll need yet another for loop to loop through the number of our item. And I'll call this variable letter for this sprite only. So I'll set letter to 1. So start with the first letter. Then we're going to repeat by the length of our number. So length of item slot plus 1 of inventory. And that is the length of the string. So if our number is 2 digits, we'll repeat twice. If it's 3 digits, we'll repeat 3 times. And each time we change letter by 1. So we'll switch costume, similarly to what we did up there, to join number this time, and letter, so letter variable of item slot plus 1 of inventory. Then we stamp, and then move to the right, so change x by 12. Ready to stamp the next number. So when we run this, and I'm going to destroy this leaf block, now we have a little 1 next to the leaf block. Again, I'll place down a few blocks of cobblestone so we can see what happens when we get more than 1 block. And you can see the number does indeed go up. I'm going to try placing enough to get us to a double-digit number, just to see if that all works well. And there we go. Looking great! Now we need to place blocks based on what thing we're selecting in our inventory. And currently we don't actually know what our selected item is, so I'll make a variable for that called selected item for all sprites. I'm going to set this to 1 when the flag is clicked. First, I'll just code up the display for it and changing it before we actually end up using it. So in our display hotbar block, and before we do our numbers, we'll just check if slot equals selected item. If so, we'll switch costume to selection and stamp, like so. Now when we run this, we should have the little selected icon in our first slot. Now when we scroll, we can change that block, that selected item, and it turns out that the arrow keys, the up and down arrow keys, will detect up and down mouse scrolls. So when up arrow key pressed, we'll change selected item by -2. We're changing by -2 because there are, again, 2 items in the list per inventory item. Now we can check if this is less than 1, and if it is, we'll move our selected item back to the end of the list. So length of inventory, then -1 to get to the item rather than the count. Now we'll do the same for the down arrow, changing by 2 this time, and if selected item is greater than length of inventory -1, set selected item to 1. Run this, and now when we scroll, we should be able to change this item. And you'll see at the very end, we display a small one as well. We can fix this by simply hiding the UI sprite. And then there it's gone. You might also want to have number key selection. We could have a separate check for each of the number keys, but I'm going to make a block called check number keys. And I'm going to use yet another for loop, setting letter. I'll use the letter variable again, set it to 1, then repeat 9, changing letter by 1. And each time we can simply check if key letter pressed, then set selected item 2, and then we need to multiply our letter by 2 and then subtract 1 to get it to be a valid slot. And then, yeah, and then we can use this block right before we display hotbar. So now if I press any of the number keys, I should jump to that slot. Wonderful. Now that we've got that, we can finally code our placing blocks. In place block, rather than replacing item targeted air with 18, we'll replace it with item selected item of inventory. Now around this, in addition to checking that our target air is greater than -1, we need to make sure that our selected item is actually an item. So item selected item of inventory is greater than the empty value. Then we need to remove this item. I'll turn this if check into an if else. I'm going to move this into the else and replace this with just a equals check. Is equivalent, it does exactly the same thing. It just looks a bit nicer. Then in the if, well, we want to do different things if we have more than one of the item or if we have just one of the item. We'll check if the count item selected item plus 1 of inventory is greater than 1. We'll replace item selected item plus 1 of inventory with this item selected item plus 1 of inventory minus 1. So we just take away 1 from the count. In the else, if we only have 1 left and we place it down, then we just remove that item from the inventory. So we replace both selected item and selected item plus 1 of inventory with the empty value. Let's run this, and then if we try to place a block, it should not do anything. Let's grab our leaf block from over here. It appears in the inventory. When we place it down, then it disappears from the inventory, and it appears like so. Place whichever item we're selecting. Select the crafting table, then we can place that down very nicely. Awesome. Now if we want more blocks, we could just add some more place blocks here. I'll let you figure out if you want to do any more of that. We could also have a creative mode. So let's add a creative mode. I'll start by making a variable that will hold whether we're in creative mode. I'll call it creative mode for all sprites. And now we need a way to get in and out of creative mode. I'll do this in UI, and I'll just use the C key for creative mode. When C key pressed, we can simply set creative mode to 1 minus creative mode. And this serves as a toggle between 1 and 0. So if creative mode is 0, 1 minus 0 is 1. If creative mode is 1, then 1 minus 1 is 0. To start, we'll want some different movement in creative mode. We'll want to be able to fly up and down and not have to worry about gravity. So in Move Player, around our MoveY scripts, which is this stuff here, I'll check with an if else and put this in the else. If creative mode is greater than 0, then we can reattach this. So the part inside the else starts with the changing speed y and ends with the changing falling. Okay, now in the if, we can simply set our speed y to, and then we can use the space key, as well as, well, because we're in turbo warp, we have access to the shift key. You may have to enable some scratch add-ons to get this, but I recommend it if you do, but keep in mind this only works within turbo warp. So space key minus shift key divided by 5, so that is sort of like our old movement. Then change player y by speed y, and then finally handle our player collisions, interaction y, speed y. So if we run this and press C, then we should be able to fly up and down. Now, a key feature of creative mode is that we have access to all of our blocks, so we can build whatever we want. So we can use our hotbar for this as well, and just have each of the blocks inside of our hotbar. Now you may notice that we have more blocks than can fit in our hotbar, so we'll want to be able to scroll along our hotbar to see different blocks. But first we need to actually fill the inventory with those blocks. I'll make a custom block called make creative inventory. Run without screen refresh. Now we're going to delete all of our inventory and then refill it. So we should loop through all of our blocks and add them to the inventory. I'll make a variable called block for this sprite only to hold what block we are currently at, and again we'll make a for loop setting block to 1, then repeating 18, which is how many blocks we have, each time changing block by 1. Now not all blocks are valid. For example, the top grass texture would not be a valid block. So we need to check if it is a valid block, and we can do that by checking if we have a matching costume for it. So we switch costume to block, which is just an empty costume. Then we switch costume to join the text block and then our block variable. So if this costume here is not a valid name, then it will not switch the costume there and it will leave us on our old block costume. So then we can check if not costume name equals block, and here this is the text block. If we have changed costume in our second switch costume block, we will execute the script, which is to add our block variable to inventory and add 1 to inventory. So for each of our valid blocks, we add one of those blocks to the inventory. Now, we can also be checking if length of inventory is greater than 16. So if all 9 slots are filled, we will stop the script. Now if these aren't enough blocks to fill all of our 9 slots, we can simply loop again. So around all this, I will put a repeat until length of inventory is greater than 16. Now we need to use this block. When C key pressed, I'll check if creative mode equals 1, meaning we just went into creative mode, and then I'll use our make creative inventory block. Let's run this, then hit the C key, and then there we go. And we should also set our creative mode to 0 when our flag is clicked. So set creative mode to 0. I'll also make a variable while we're here called numBlocks, which holds how many blocks there are, because right now we're just using that number 18 in our loop. We might want more blocks than that, and if so, we don't want to have to go and manually change each of those numbers. So back in our make creative inventory block, we'll just stick this numBlocks right here when we repeat. So when we enter creative mode, there we are, there's our inventory. And then when we leave creative mode, we still have the inventory, so we can just delete all of inventory right here when C is pressed. There we go. Awesome. Okay, now if we try placing down our blocks, like so, they just disappear from the inventory. And in fact, when we break them, they will reappear. In our game sprite, in place block, we'll just check if creative mode is less than 1 around our removing item from inventory scripts here. Then in break block, we can do the same thing around our add to inventory. Running this again, enter creative mode, and now we should be able to place down our blocks like so without them disappearing from the inventory. Wonderful. Let's also make destroying blocks a little bit quicker. So we can check if mouse equals 22 minus creative mode times, say, 10. So if we're in creative mode, it takes 10 less frames to break. So you'll see there's a bit quicker. You can make that even faster if you want, but then sometimes it gets hard to control. Okay, now we need a way to access our other blocks that don't fit on this hotbar. We can do this by shifting our inventory to the left or right. So I'll make a custom block called shift inventory right, run without screen refresh. So for this block, we'll want to delete the last item of the inventory and then add a new item on the left. So we'll start by deleting last of inventory, and we can type last into one of these text inputs here, copy it, Control C, and then paste it right here, Control V. And then we can do that twice. Then we need to get the first item of the inventory, and then find the block that comes before it. So we'll start by setting block to item 1 of inventory. Then we'll repeat by num blocks, so 18 times. If we don't find a block after this, then we should not keep checking. Each time, changing block by -1. And again, we need to use our costume check. So I'll just duplicate that from down here. So switch costume to block, switch costume to join block block, then if not costume name equals block. Rather than adding things to the end of inventory, we will insert them. So we'll start by inserting the count, add 1 of inventory. Then we insert block, add 1 of inventory. Once we've done that, we don't want to do that anymore, so we stop the script. We also want to be able to loop, so if block is less than 1, we set block to num blocks. Okay, now we will make our shift inventory left block. I'm going to duplicate our code here because it's very similar. However, we'll want to be deleting the first item of the inventory this time, and then set block to item. Here we don't want the very last one because that is the count. We want to set it to length of inventory -1 of inventory. So the second to the end. Now we are changing block by 1 this time, so looking for the next block rather than the previous one. And check if block is greater than num blocks, set block to 1. Then rather than inserting, we will add block to inventory, and then add 1 to inventory. Now we actually need to use these blocks, and we'll do that in the arrow keys. So we can get an if-else, put this stuff in the else, and check if creative mode equals 1. In which case, with the up arrow, we'll shift inventory right. With the down arrow, we will shift inventory left. Right, to run this, make sure normal scrolling works. Let's just try breaking a block like that. Yep, this seems to be working fine. Let's go into creative mode, and then when we scroll, our list of blocks should scroll. Let's put our cursor in the middle as well, just so we can see blocks on either side of us. So in Make Creative Inventory, I'll just set selected item to 9, which is the middle one. This actually represents the 5th item. So now, entering creative mode, we should be selected on the middle item, and then we can see what blocks are to the left and right of our selected item. Now let's see how our number keys work with this. And they don't scroll the inventory. So if you just wanted to use your number keys to choose a block, you could not have the full range of blocks. So let's fix that. In our check number keys, well, we want to scroll our inventory when we press the number keys, but we only want to do it once. And this code is running even if we hold it down. So at the end, we can check. Well, first we should check if creative mode is greater than 0, so we only run these scripts when we're in creative mode. But then we can check if not key, and then we can find our key based on the selected item. So we reverse this formula basically. We use selected item plus 1 divided by 2. Well, we always want to scroll, so our selected item is at 5, but we only want to do it when we are not pressing that key, so we don't have any issues with holding down the key. We can check with an if-else. If this is less than 5, less than the middle one, we'll want to scroll to the right. Otherwise, we'll want to scroll to the left. And so we repeat 5, which is our target, minus this. So the difference between the center slot and the current slot, that's how many times we repeat, shifting inventory to the right. And then at the end of that, we'll just set our selected item back to 9, which remember is the 5th slot. Then in the else, we do the same thing, but we reverse it because this selected item value is now greater than 5. So we do this minus 5. and shift inventory left. Like so. Now we can run this, enter creative mode, and now when we press our keys, you'll see the inventory scrolls to that position. Then we can place it down. Lovely. Okay, this is looking great. So now we can build things. That's fun. We could build a little house if we wanted to. Keep in mind that we can't place any blocks off of the edge of the world, but we can still do stuff like this. I'll let you have fun with this. Now I would love to see your projects, so please do add them to the studio for the 3D tutorial, because I would love to see what you've been making. So with all that said, I hope you enjoyed this video. Have a great rest of your day, and goodbye!